This is Susan at Downeast Thunder Farm. I'm going to show you how to make one of my felt birds today. I've chosen the rose-breasted grosbeak because it uses many of the stitches and techniques you'll find in my other patterns, and you'll see how they go together. This pattern is from one of my kits. The free ones available for download at downeastthunderfarm.com look a little bit different than this, but you'll find all of the necessary parts. When I cut out felt for my critters, I only use one piece of felt at a time. And yes, that means I have to cut everything out twice if I'm doing a double-sided ornament. But I find that I get neater cuts if I do it this way. And sometimes when I'm using black felt, I find that the lines on the edge of the pattern make it difficult for me to follow. So I'll just flip it over and use the side that has no print. So I use my fabric scissors, and these are labeled fabric and they go in the do not touch drawer. And I'm just going to cut out the edges. Sometimes when I'm working with felt, my pattern pieces grow, because it's hard to cut them the exact same size as the piece of paper, and that's okay because we'll trim them down the road. One of the tricks I like to use for some very small pieces is to take a piece of freezer paper. This is waxy on one side, it's got paper on the other, and I'll lay it over my pattern piece. I'll trace it, and then I'll iron this to the piece of felt, and that'll make it a lot easier to cut out. The first step on the rose-breasted grosbeak is to sew on the breast, and I'm going to dry fit that with the head so I can get it in just the right spot, and I want the head to overlap the breast just a little bit. The floss we use in this project is standard 6-strand embroidery floss, and if you play with the ends, you can pull out one strand like that. You're going to thread your needle, and then on the other end, you're going to make a knot. And so you're going to wrap it around till the two ends meet, roll them together, and then pull, and you'll get a knot on the end. I'm going to tack in just a couple of spots along the top because that'll be hidden by the head and you won't see the stitches. So I just want to hold it in place. But along this inside edge, I'm going to do a running stitch. And I often refer to inside edges, and this is what I mean by the inside edge. This outside edge we don't need to stitch because all of those layers will be stitched together when we do the finishing blanket stitch. So I'll just do a quick running stitch. And then on the back, I'll tie it off, and to do that, I just catch a tiny bit of the felt in my needle and just make a couple of stitches. So the next step for this bird is to put the head in place, and I am going to stitch with a running stitch to hold it in place. So I'm going to start over on this edge and then just work my way. When working with floss, I like to cut a piece about 18 inches long to work with. If you've ordered one of my kits, you might get longer pieces. Cut it down to a size that works for you. If you work with too long a piece, a lot of times it can get knotted, and that's endlessly frustrating and wastes floss by the time you've had to trim it down to get the knot out. we go. The next piece is the beak. I'm going to position the beak. That looks about good. And I'm going to make a tiny running stitch for the mouth, and that will hold it in place. And I'll use the curve of my thumbnail to guide my needle. There we go. So now it's time for the eye. And in this case, I'm using a little piece of gray felt. The original pattern might call for black, but I've decided that I like the gray better. That looks good. My patterns call for tacking the eye with an X, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to make 2 stitches through the middle of the eye. To hold this in place. There we go. So I like to finish off the eyes with a seed bead, and I use these little 11mm glass beads. And to put that on, using a beading needle, I come up through the back. I scoop one of these up on my needle, let it slide down the thread, and just tuck a stitch back in like that. And in this case, the beak is flopping around a touch. So I'm going to put a tiny stitch up here in the corner just to hold that in place like that. There we go. I like the glass seed beads for the eyes because it just makes the eye pop and makes the bird look a little bit more three-dimensional, and I think it just adds a bit to the whole ornament. The next step is the tail. And when you are going to do a double-sided pattern that has elements that extend beyond the body, it really helps to take your first side and match it up just to make sure that your pieces are going to align when you're finished. So I'm just going to hold this in place with my hand and do a really rough stitch. It doesn't matter if this looks pretty because it's not going to show. It's going to be hidden by the wing. There we go. The wing is the next piece to tuck in. And I am going to put a pin in to hold it all into place. And I'm going to do a running stitch along the inside edge of the wing. And I've still got my black thread on the needle. And so I'll work my way up the edge. And the thing about these birds and animals that I design is, yes, they're my design, but there's no one right way to create them. They're yours. There's a little piece of you in every one that you make. So you can make your own decisions along the way. I feel kind of like Bob Ross, you know, just make a happy little tree. Just make a happy little bird. And if you want to get fanciful with your designs, or if you want to go with funky colors that aren't entirely found in the natural world, go for it. There we go. While I have the black still on the needle, I'm going to put in these little stitches that run along the belly. And to do this, I'm just going to go wherever I feel like they look good. And I'm going to do 2 tiny stitches side by side, butting up against each other to give it a little bit of a curve, like so. The next step on our rose-breasted grosbeak is to add the decorative stitches to the wing. And to do this, I'm going to use 2 strands of white floss because I want the decoration to really stand out. I add stitches freehand, but sometimes I will use the pattern piece to figure out where my stitches should begin. So I'll just bring my needle up through and pull the pattern piece off. And then I know where my run of stitches should begin. Sometimes when you're doing a long run of stitches in a graceful curve, it is hard to do that freehand. So what I've been known to do is, and I've just got that taped there, I will actually cut out along the line, and then I'll position that, and I'll use that as a guide and just sew along the edge of the paper so I can keep that graceful curve. So there I have that curve. I didn't take a lot of time with my stitches today because I don't want to keep you here forever. But normally, I'm fairly picky about the stitches, and I will pull them out and redo them if I don't have them in just the right spot. And I take time to try find the right placement of the needle. And sometimes I'll pull the thread ahead to kind of get a sense for where that stitch ought to go. And I'll use that as a guide as well. The next step is to do these teardrop shaped stitches, and those are called lazy daisy stitches. For the longest time, I had to look the instructions up on how to do them every time I made one. Now it's become second nature. You're going to start by bringing your needle up through the fabric where you want the point of the stitch to be, like that. And then we're going to go in just in front of that stitch, and we're going to bring our needle through, but we're not going to pull the floss all the way through. We're going to bring the needle back up through the fabric where we want the curve to be, and we're simply going to loop our floss over so we catch it. And then I'm going to just take the needle back down on the other side of that. And then I can use my pin head or my needle head to just arrange things like so. We need a few more up here. So I'll start where I want my point to be, come up where I want my curve to be, loop my floss over, and then a tiny stitch on the other side to hold it in place. And there we go. The next step is to fashion legs for the bird. This bird uses very simple legs, and I'll show you how I do this. And then I'll show you how I do some of the legs for my other birds. Use a length of wire, and I wrap it around my finger, and I make one twist. And then I tuck it on the back of the bird, and I just look and see where I might want the feet to be. So I'll give it a little angle there and a little bend there. And I'll use my wire snips, or since this is soft aluminum wire, I'll use my knot fabric scissors and snip that off. So it's on this back side that we're going to tack this into place. Already multiple layers of felt, so I'm just going to put a few stitches just going through a little bit of the floss to hold these legs in place. And since I'm tacking this where there are already multiple layers of felt, it's easier to hide those stitches on the front than if you were just going through one piece of felt. But there we go. There are the legs for the grosbeak. Let me show you how I do legs for some of my other birds. The song sparrow has one method of legs, as does my owl, and I'll show you how to make each of those. For the song sparrow, I'm going to loop the wire around my finger. So I get a nice loop at the end, and then I'm just going to twist the two pieces around each other. I'm going to push this loop back in on itself and then bring those ends down like that. And then on this side, I will make a loop like that. And then you could have that style of legs. Then there's my owls, and the owls, I like to have them look like they have claws. So I'll show you how I do that. And for that, I'll use a pencil, and I'm going to fold the wire in half and crease the end. And then I'm going to use the pencil to wrap the folded wire, 2-3 times maybe, and then slide it off the pencil. And then the other end, I will make a loop for stitching. And then you can pull these out just a little touch if you like. And then you could have for your owl's feet like that. So I have my two sides. They're mirror images, and take care that you make mirror images. I have ended up with two birds facing right before, and they became magnets. I'm going to take a look at the back, and you can see how my wing and head grew just a touch during the making. So I'm going to trim that down a little bit. That looks good. I'm going to take a look at this guy, and he looks pretty good. So now the trick is to sew the two together. But before that, we need to think about how we're going to use this. I tack my birds up on my bulletin board, but you might want to hang these from a Christmas tree or another type of dowel or some other decoration to display them in your house. In that case, you might want to put a little ribbon, stitch it to the wrong side of one of these birds, and then you can sandwich it between for a hanging ornament. Or you could just do a plain back. You could do a plain backing of felt and put a magnet on the back. So lots of different ways you can use these. For this bird, I'm going to use 2 strands of black floss to sew this together. But on some patterns, I decide that it looks better if I will match the floss for the blanket stitch to the color of the felt. In some cases, it doesn't lend itself to the bird design to have the same color of floss all the way around, but I think on this Grosbeak, it will look just fine. So I have my black floss on an embroidery needle. I'm going to pin this in a couple of spots. So it doesn't travel as I put the stitches in. And I like to begin my stitches in a place where they can be hidden. So starting here at the tail makes sense. So I'm going to come in from the back of one of the pieces, tuck the knot out of the way, and I'm just going to get a first stitch in place. So a blanket stitch, take your needle down, and then you catch the loop with the needle. And I'll continue this so you can get the hang of it. Down through the front, loop the floss over the needle, pull it through. Down through the front, loop the floss over the needle, pull it through. You can see the feet rotate a little bit. We're going to catch those legs in our blanket stitch, and that will hold them where we want them to be. So this stitch is just going to go on the other side of the wire, and I'm going to bring my thread up between them, catch a loop, there. Now we're almost finished. I have about another 1.5 inches left to do. And this is when we want to stop and add some fiber fill to the bird. I'm going to tuck my finger in just to puff him up a little bit. And fiber fill is this polyester material that you can get from Hobby Lobby, Joann Fabrics, Walmart. I'm sure you can get it from Amazon as well. And I just take little bits and lightly stuff. I don't want him to look stuffed like a pillow. I just want a little bit of definition. And I better take these pins out. That will work a little better. There we go. And so maybe just a touch more. So if you buy one of my kits, you get more than enough fiber fill for these birds because they don't take very much at all. And that just gives him a little bit of poof. And then I continue on with my blanket stitch. There we go. I'm just going to do a couple of tiny loops to tie that off. And then instead of just snipping this and have a dangling edge, I tuck my needle back through so it comes out the other side. And then I'll tug this and then snip so that the loose end tucks back in to the bird. So there is our Downeast Thunder Farm rose-breasted grosbeak. There are probably 150 free patterns at downeastthunderfarm.com. You'll find an elephant and owls and butterflies and whimsical Volkswagens and more birds. So during these days of COVID-19, when we're all trying to figure out what a new normal is, maybe you can find a little bit of joy at Downeast Thunder Farm. Take a visit, print out some patterns, order some felt or use scraps of fabric you have at home, and start making some of your own wildlife critters and birds, and have fun.